We move to the last talk of the pre-lunch session by Sutapa, right?
Thank you. So let me start by thanking the organizers for this very kind invitation. So I'm going to talk about mainly phase separation dynamics upon a temperature quench when the system has an inhomogeneous temperature field. And kinetics of phase separation upon a quench was already introduced by Kavita in the morning session. So I'm not going to introduce that. Let me just tell you why we are interested in it. Well, if you look at the state of the literature for phase separation dynamics, it's very well studied for isothermal systems and instantaneous quenches. But if your system has a temperature gradient or an inhomogeneous temperature field, that is not very well studied. So that's what we are mainly interested in. And there are some studies where there is a temperature gradient and that's a stationary temperature gradient. But when you have temperature fields which are evolving with time, how does the phase separation happen that way? So that's what basically we are studying. And in particular, what I'm going to talk about is that suppose you have a system which is close to a second order phase transition, okay? And there is a cooling source in the system, okay? So from this, the cold temperature fronts are propagating away. And the source, this now is also moving in the system. So this is like you have a cooling source and it's basically translating in the system. And as it's moving, it's basically the cold fronts are propagating out and some structure is going to form. So this introduces two velocities in the system. One is the velocity with which these cold fronts are propagating out radially. That velocity, we call it, let's say, V. And then there's a translational motion of the cooling source. Let's say it's moving with a velocity with a speed Vs. So there's going to be a competition between these two speeds, V and Vs, which is going to dictate the final kind of pattern that's going to form. Okay. So just to mention, in the limiting case, so when you have this Vs is tending to 0, you are expected to get the results for the spinodal decompositions that one observes for stationary sources and vice versa. And the most interesting part is when the Vs and V both actually have finite values and they are comparable. Okay, so the way we study is basically following the Kahn-Hilliard-Cook kind of approach. And I'll skip the introduction to it because this audience, we all know it. Just to mention that briefly, so you start with the free energy functional, okay, the Ginzburg-Landau free energy functional, and then if you assume there is a concentration current in the system, you can arrive at this Kahn-Hilliard-Cook equation. Now in isothermal system, this A is a constant, doesn't depend on space. In our system, because we have an inhomogeneous temperature field, this A is now both space and time dependent. And this is the term through which the coupling is coming into the picture. So initially, the entire system is at a high temperature, homogeneous phase, and then you introduce the cooling source from which the cold fronts are propagating out, okay? Which means that if I look at a distance which is less than this Vt, okay? So that's the distance where basically the cold front has propagated. And in terms of this reduced unit T, which is basically the deviation from the critical temperature, this is going to be less than 0. And we are interested in studying which kind of patterns are forming. So these are the results from the numerical simulations. Let's first start with the situation where the translational speed is very small. What you see is that some concentric circular rings are forming, okay? And we have found out that it's actually forming because the things are more or less symmetric because it's not really moving fast. So the next question is, what happens when the speed becomes larger? So let's look at this one. Here, the velocity of the propagation of the cooling front, the V is kept constant in both cases. What changes is the speed of the source. This case, they are basically they're the same, V and Vs. And in this case, the translational speed is larger. And if you compare the two different pictures here, these are basically the temperature fronts, the contour till which the cold front has propagated. You see, when the translational velocity is similar to the spreading velocity, the temperature control has a circular shape, okay? Whereas if you compare this one, this has clearly gained some kind of asymmetric behavior. And that's because now the source is moving faster as compared to the spreading velocity. Okay. So the different colors here are corresponding to different times. As you see, as time progresses, the contour getting basically bigger and bigger. Similarly, one can now look at the snapshot, the order parameter profile. What you see here is that when the two velocities are equal, the patterns which are forming are also more or less they are circular. Okay? And in between, you have certain stripes which are basically of different phases, let's say A and B type of phases. Whereas when you have the translational speed much larger, in this case, the order parameter profile also picks up the asymmetric pattern. Okay. We also did some kind of quantification of the patterns which are forming. So how much time do I have? Okay. So one of the things that we look at is the question we ask is why is it that it's getting basically asymmetric? How is it changing? So what I plot here is the width of this temperature contour, which I showed you before as a function of time for different speed combinations. And as it turns out, it's actually growing linearly with time, okay? Because it's spreading radially with a constant velocity. If you look at the domain patterns which are forming, and if you look at the average domain size, so that seems to follow a linear behavior as a function of time. Okay. So what we found is that you can actually tune the velocities, these two velocities which you have, you can actually tune them in different combinations, and you get different kind of patterns which are forming. So here I show the complete phase diagram that one obtains if you basically change the combination of the two different velocities. And why is it interesting? Because it actually gives you a route through which, by tuning these two velocities, you can actually control the final morphology that's going to form. And we also did observe that these structures which I'm talking about, they do not exhibit any kind of self-similarity upon scaling the correlation functions. So this is the main story which I wanted to tell you. So just to conclude, what I presented to you is the study of phase separation dynamics when you have a cooling source which is moving through a system. Okay? And we find that the final structure depends on the combination of both the velocities which are involved in, in this motion. And the structures do not obey the self-similar behavior. So with that, I would like to conclude and thank you for your attention. Thank you. Right, so far correct. We haven't, included that into the modeling. I'm sure that will have some role and it will, give rise to a much richer phase behavior. Right. Sure, yeah. Absolutely, yes, yeah. Right, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I agree with you. So in this case, the velocity which you are considering, V, so that's basically, like taking care of the heat diffusion. So, yeah.
Okay. So there is something called liquid-liquid phase separation in biology, where
Right.
these proteins form these phase-separated clusters. Okay, and one of the ways they can be induced is, for example, a morphogen or some kind of a stress signal that is propagating through the system. So my question to you is, how can you actually sort of adapt your framework to those situations where instead of having, say, a temperature gradient, you have a chemical gradient, and the chemical front is sort of propagating and inducing this kind of phase separation?
Right. So, probably one can look at such things by, if you consider some kind of front and the front is actually propagating. Right, yeah.
So
So I think,
Starvation front, for example, you can show that it's almost like a reaction diffusion front in some situations.
correct, right, yeah. So I think that's a very interesting, sort of application of this kind of Hilliard kind of things in the more biologically oriented system. So yeah, so I'll be very happy to talk to you after this. Thank you.
Okay, then it's okay. I just have one confusion, like you're moving this cold source and which you can control, but then the front should just emerge from the equations, right? But it looked like that you're also controlling that. I was a bit confused.
Temperature front is evolving from the equation.
Right, yeah, so but that's, so there are two velocities, but
Right.
one you can control, the other just emerges, right? But it looked like you can
But they're
control
actually
both.
controlling the two, both of them, right?
How? Because, I mean,
Because, so this velocity, the spreading velocity, that's actually dictated by the diffusivity, the ratio of thermal diffusivity and thermal conductivity.
so that should just follow from the equations,
Correct,
right?
correct, right. But it's also moving. So then the ratio of these two velocities, that is finally controlling the pattern which is forming. So say, for example, if I go back to this one, if the source velocity is very large, it will finally turn out to be a very asymmetric kind of a structure. So both the velocities are actually important.
So let's thank Sutapa and close the session and break for lunch. Prashant, you had a question? You had a, okay. So maybe just one.
Everyone for taking some time. The wonderful presentation. Just one question, because this looks very similar to the kind of things that engineers study in aerodynamics, particularly Mach cone angles and whatnot. So my question was, do you actually see any jump discontinuity in, let's say, as the velocities of these two things are close to each other? Because typically in aerodynamics, you see that a normal shock wave basically separates two regions of two different pressures. There is actually a jump discontinuity when the Mach number is close to 1. So I was wondering if there is any analog here with respect to any order parameter which is showing some sort of a jump.
So we didn't really, try to explore any kind of the jump discontinuity which we're talking about.
Okay.
But yeah, maybe I'll talk to you later.
Sure.
It might have some
Thank
kind
you.
of relevance here.
Thank you. Cheers.